Welcome to Roundtable Decision. I am your host, Wyatt Birkenoff. You have come to the right place for a political look at certain political events and ideas with an unbiased, fact-based approach, as well as a philosophy-based approach for philosophy topics like Marxism and others. If you are IB, CAS, AP, or any student who is familiar with how the UN works, these next videos will be quite familiar. But for those who don't know what the UN is or how they work, these next two videos will demonstrate how the UN works and if they are successful or unsuccessful, and what it means to be successful with the UN and what it means not to be successful with the UN.
In 2015, the United Nations turned 70. Since World War II, the UN has existed to foster communication between its member states to achieve global goals, which would be impossible individually. So how do they do this? How exactly does the UN work? Well, the UN is divided into 6 main parts. The first is the General Assembly, which includes nearly all internationally recognized countries, making up 193 member states. The Assembly meets annually in September and debates issues on security and diplomacy. In 2015, the major topic is climate change and helping developing countries face the threat of global warming. Within the General Assembly, resolutions relating to defense, as well as administrative issues like new membership and budget, require a 2/3 vote. Most other issues only need a majority. Every country, regardless of size, gets a single vote. However, there are 2 states in the UN which are not actual members: the Vatican, whose government is called the Holy See, and Palestine. These are called permanent non-member observer states, and while they can't vote, they are allowed to take part in debates. The second arm of the UN is the Security Council. It exists to prevent conflict on a large scale, promoting peace through diplomacy or sanctions. It only has 5 permanent members: Russia, France, China, the UK, and the US, which were all winning powers in World War II. The permanent members have veto power, and their use has been incredibly controversial. The US, for example, has vetoed dozens of resolutions against Israel for their actions in the Middle East. There are 10 more members representing Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Western Europe. Those 10 are elected on a rolling basis every 2 years to make sure that major world regions have representation. The Security Council's resolutions are carried out by the UN's peacekeeping force, which boasts about 100,000 soldiers. One of the most important parts of the UN is the Economic and Social Council, which works to improve standards of living and promote human rights. Most of what the UN actually does is centered around helping developing countries. The Council works with specialized agencies like the World Health Organization and High Commission for Refugees to make that happen. The judicial arm of the UN is the International Court of Justice. This is where international law violations are debated and prosecuted, although countries with significant power can often refuse to comply with their decisions. The 5th arm of the UN is actually not operational. The Trusteeship Council was created in the 1940s to help developing territories and dependencies become independent countries. The council was suspended in 1994 after helping more than 70 countries gain independence. And finally, the Secretariat is essentially the internal administrative workings of the UN. They're the ones who compile reports, communicate between the different councils, and are headed by the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. Although the UN exists to promote global cooperation, many have criticized the greater influence of the 5 permanent security.
70 years ago, the United Nations Charter was signed and ratified, creating the world's most comprehensive global leadership organization. The UN's main goals include improving education, child mortality rates, maternal health, gender equality, and many other initiatives. So can they do it? Exactly how effective is the United Nations? The United Nations emerged after World War II with the objective of achieving a global balance of peace between world powers. Today, they have 193 member states, and they have roughly 100,000 soldiers or Blue Berets operating 16 separate peacekeeping missions around the globe. That's about equal to the active manpower of Canada. They also have numerous government branches like the World Health Organization and the International Court of Justice to further focus peacekeeping efforts. But even with so many assets, they have been criticized at times for inefficiency and ineffectiveness. Specific instances that haunt the UN are conflicts during the 1990s in Rwanda, Somalia, and the former Yugoslavia. The peacekeeping forces that were sent there were too small to cope with the violence. As a result, many people were killed. These incidents forced the United Nations to reassess their resources and methods of handling ongoing wars. But there have been many other successful peacekeeping missions throughout places like Angola, Namibia, El Salvador, and Mozambique. United Nations officials can monitor ceasefire agreements and observe demilitarization efforts. Officials also regulate nuclear proliferation with their International Atomic Energy Agency. Thanks primarily to UN organizations, smallpox has been completely eradicated since 1980, and polio is expected to be eliminated in 2018. The UN has improved literacy rates across the globe, child mortality rates, and women's rights. They also work to extract dangerous landmines across the globe and combat terrorism. As a result of extensive and innovative humanitarian work, UN officials, UN agencies, and the entire organization itself has been awarded 11 Nobel Prizes over the years. So, is the United Nations effective? Well, although they've had their setbacks in the past, the organization is without a doubt the strongest, most wide-reaching, and well-respected global peace initiative the world has ever seen. As long as they retain support and commitment from their members, the United Nations could finally be the one.
So how effective is the UN really is the main question we have to consider. The United Nations has 193 countries, or nations, will get together under one building called the General Assembly and only have one vote and can make non-binding resolutions. In other words, they can suggest what countries should do. For example, with water control in nations and water sustainability, they can make a binding issue saying you must conserve this amount of water, but it's up to the country itself and if they decide to conserve that much water. The United Nations does have an enforcement group, so to speak, even though it's not really much of an enforcement group, and they won't even call it really an enforcement group. They're not even really police. They're kind of they're a little bit lower than police, I guess you could call it, and with the peacekeepers. And these peacekeepers for the UN go in to enforce the rules, so to speak, even though it's tricky balance between enforcing the rules and keeping peace. So the object of peacekeepers is keeping the peace. But the peacekeepers have been called to make even more damage for the countries needing peace. So in other words, when peacekeepers come, the issue gets even more larger than when the peacekeepers weren't there. And the peacekeepers before have been caught in several mistreatment of the citizens, including rape as one of the examples of what has been caused from peacekeepers being there. But peacekeepers have also helped other nations in keeping peace. So what's that balance between if peacekeepers should be used and if they shouldn't be used? This is the same way for the United Nations. You can suggest something to the country, and it's up to the country and if they do it. If they do it, then the United Nations ends up being a success. But if the country doesn't do it, then the United Nations can be considered a failure. But you can't blame that one country for making the whole United Nations be considered a failure, so to speak. A quick glance at peacekeeping definition states this. Peacekeeper. The noun peacekeeper means exactly what it sounds, like a person who tries to keep things peaceful, often by maintaining conflicts or calming people down. So as said before, this is a tricky balance between calming the culture of what you went into and almost like fitting in order to keep the peace, or causing more violence with you being there. Because let's face it, not everybody is going to want peacekeepers to show up in their nation and say, hey, you have to do it this way, and only this way. The UN is not just the General Assembly and Security Council. They also have What Do We Do? If you have a quick look on their website and go to their tab What We Do, it states this: maintain international peace and security, protect human rights, deliver humanitarian aid, promote sustainable development, and uphold international law. If you click over Maintain International Peace and Security, it states Security Council, General Assembly, Peacekeeping, Peace Building, Countering Terrorism, Disarmament, and Prevent Diplomacy and Mediation. A quick glance at peacekeeping basically states that it is an effective tool to disarm, demobilize, and regain formal competence, and support constitutional processes in the form of elections and others. So if a nation requests peacekeepers, it can be used to maintain a peaceful way to have an election, or a peaceful way, or an attempt of a peaceful way to restore peace. A quick glance at protect human rights. Human rights is a big thing for the United Nations and has been proven to be somewhat successful over the years with certain countries, and depending on where you look, it's extremely successful. Have a quick glance, and protect human rights includes Human Rights Council, Human Rights Treaty bodies, special procedures, UNDG HARM, which is the United Nations Development Group's human rights mainstreaming, democracy, the International Bill of Rights, Security Council, Third Committee of the General Assembly, various other UN bodies, Security Council, UN Peace Operations, and Commission on the Status of Women. A glance at deliver humanitarian aid has OSHA and the UN system, helping refugees, helping children, feeding the hungry, healing the sick. A look at promote sustainable development includes a sustainable development agenda, development goals, climate change, what was on the mission statement for last year's United Nations, disaster risk reduction, gender equality and empowering women, and what are the main UN offices and programs working on development? The UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. What UN bodies work to promote development? The General Assembly Second Committee. And then uphold international law is the International Court of Justice. I will have a video on the International Court of Justice if needed, because it is somewhat of an interesting concept, what I find quite interesting. And there's 15 total judges, and they make international laws, or attempts at international laws, to restore peace, and could be considered one of the most effective UN charters because these laws they make can be somewhat enforced if needed by the peacekeepers, and have worked across some nations in helping children in the workforce and having equal rights. This month's topic is going to be the United Nations as a whole. What charters do you think work the best? Do you think the General Assembly works? Do you think the idea is good, bad, needs work? What do you think about the General Assembly? Do you think the Security Council should have the veto powers of the main 5 countries? Do you think they should have lesser terms or more terms for the other nations in the Security Council? What are your thoughts about the General Assembly and Security Council? As well as taking a look at the UN charters, like like international law and human rights, and having a look at, do you think that part of the United Nations works better? Just general thoughts about the United Nations is where we're going with this topic choice for this month. Thank you for listening to my political topic choice 1, really the first one of the month, even though we briefly discussed over the Discord with the political intro video. If you want to join in my project, click below on the channel description, and there is the Discord link down there. Discord is an app what you can download on your phone and computer for your use in my project and for gaming or whatever else you want to use it with. I don't want to sound like a 10-year-old, but the likes and subscribes are a good way to improve this YouTube channel. So like and subscribe is always, a plus. Thank you.
The first, the last, I got the moves like Jack. I'm cursed with swag, ain't nothing worse than that. That hurt, that tax, they try and take like half. Y'all TSA, get your hand up out of my back.